Thank you so much. So very excited that you could all join today. We've got some great presentations. We're going to have two presenters, then we'll take a bit of a break, then we'll have the next two presenters, and then we're getting into some strategic planning consultations after that, but we'll start with the thematic presentations. And the theme that you're joining us for is work as imagined versus work as done, the realities of working in complex community engagement initiatives. And we're really lucky to have some really great presenters. So the first two presenters are Troy Anderson and Stephan Field, who introduced themselves. They're from the Sprott School of Business and the School of Industrial Design, and they're presenting on interdisciplinary community engagement.
Hi, everyone. Well, this morning, Stephen and I are here to take you on a really whirlwind tour of the community engagement format we've been building and refining over the past 8 years. We'll look first at some of the elements of the format, and then we'll show you a couple examples of the dozens of projects that students have been working on. Next slide. The initiative started in Tanzania back in 2014, and it's now expanded to several northern communities, including the Nacho Nayakdan in Mayo in the Yukon and the Haida community in Masset, British Columbia, among others. Here you see a Carleton group in Tanzania. The most important aspect of our framework is its interdisciplinarity. We started out with business, industrial design, and environmental engineering. And over the years, other disciplines such as food sciences have participated. Students work on projects in interdisciplinary teams, which allows them to look at the problems that they're given from multiple angles and approaches. Next slide. So just a brief comment on the history of the project. The initiative began with a single project, which was how to address issues around the collection, the treatment, and storage of water in a drought-stricken district in Tanzania. Since then, student projects have expanded to many areas, including waste management, energy, health and wellness, play and sports, infrastructure, community shelters, hydroponics, food sovereignty, lots of different things. So here you see one of our traditional water walks on which students must transport water several kilometers, exactly like the women and girls in the community have to do it each day. The women take great delight in having the students do this, by the way, especially the male students, as men in the community never have to carry water. Next slide. So the keystone of our framework is an intensive multi-week field trip to the communities we're working with. There are many logistical and financial challenges around this approach, of course, but we find the field work is both crucial to project success and not to mention life-changing for many students. Field work is crucial because it gives students the opportunity to test their ideas with end users, and they usually find that their initial assumptions about both the community and the problem are flawed. It also increases commitment and engagement on the community side because working directly with the students results in personal relationships. Students don't work in community, but they engage with community, and that's an important distinction. I might add that Carleton has never given us a penny, any kind of financial resources for this program. We've done it on our own, so it is possible to do these kinds of things. Here you see students working together with locals at a sand dam, which is a catchment for rain runoff. Next slide. So we encourage students to be pragmatic. They think about large, complex problems that are presented to them, but they have to propose small, realistic, high-impact solutions that are low cost, that can be made in the community, and that could potentially provide entrepreneurial opportunities for community members. And so here you see a girl using a tippy tap, which is a very basic hand wash system built with wood, twine, and recycled cooking oil containers. Carleton students worked with primary school kids to build these tippy taps near outdoor washrooms with no sanitation facilities at primary schools in the area. Next slide.
So here you see co-creation and co-design. So it's really interesting that we set up a student team of both Sprott and industrial design. They work with women to design the projects. By doing, the students demonstrate their concepts to the women. This integrated process allows ideas to be generated by all parties, even with the constraints of language and cultural differences. Next slide, please. Students connect with the community. Here you see a student along with a local student explain the project community audience. Simple visuals and prototypes that have been developed during the visit, and that's key, during the visit, allow the students to better understand the best methods to communicate and get the valuable feedback. Next slide, please. Here you see how once the projects are presented, the community takes over the activity, discusses the pros and cons of the solutions among themselves. Often students will conduct fly on the wall method of observing and viewing the interaction of the community members. Also, during and after the discussion, the students will interact with one member who's a translator to review the comments made. Even with language barriers, the students being immersed in the discussion, students will see the passion, and that's key, the passion expressed by the community for the work done. Next slide, please. This is appropriate hands-on. The project must be able to be touched and experienced by the community for them to evaluate. Working prototypes, and I really mean that, working prototypes that could develop assistance are used not just to see what has been fabricated, but see the products and services that are produced by the product. For example, clean water. Viewing these possibilities, the community can immerse themselves into the project to see how the local manufacturer can lead to self-sufficiency. Next one. Next slide. Active engagement. Students must present their projects with community members. To do this, they must work intense and immersively with them, and so that they can all so everybody's on the same page with the same understanding with about the nature and the purpose of the projects.
Next slide. So one really important aspect of what we're doing is that the communities give us the problems to work on, but the problems that they give us are often ill-defined and complex, and it's up to the students to define what the problem actually is, the root problem, which may not be obvious. And here we see a clear problem, smoke and soot inside a house. This is the cause of respiratory illness, which is the second cause of death of young children in the region. And this comes from three-stone cooking inside houses with no chimneys or windows. And so students had to look at that problem and say, how are we going to fix it? A crucial aspect of the problems we work on is they are defined by the community. Okay, so it's not, we don't go in there and say, here's the problem, they give it to us. Not by us, not by the students, by the communities themselves. The sense of ownership on the part of the community is a necessary condition for the success of this kind of project. Next slide. We always have the students do workshops with community kids to get the youth enthused and involved in the projects. And this can range from demonstrations of water purification methods to asking the kids to draw their own solutions to the problem. Next slide.
You're muted.
One thing the students must do is that they must prototype, whether it's a program, service, or a product, whatever. This is a prototype of a stove that reduces the amount of smoke in homes, as we saw earlier with that great smoky picture. Some of the materials may be brought in, but again, most of the prototype is done by the student interacting with the local businesses to produce testable products. Next slide. This is a charcoal kiln. This product takes animal dung. Whoops, could you go back, please? As you can see, this takes animal dung combined with the binding agent, paper, and then baked in a student-designed, locally produced kiln. It repurposes the waste to produce a slow smoke charcoal for cooking. And if I may, I'd like to play a little video now to give you an idea of the project.
Let me know if the audio is not working, please.
The audio's not working.
It's okay, we don't need the audio.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just
Okay.
music.
Yeah, I'm going to talk along this. This is a prototype that was done in Tanzania. It was just done with paint cans, etc., and soup cans. This is the designer, Stacy Lynn. Then after the charcoal was produced, it was tested to see if it could boil water. And also evaluate the amount of smoke that it produced. She presented a project to the group. They got a lot of understanding of it. They also got to look at the product that was produced from it.
We've hit 50 seconds. Would you like
Yes.
me to move to the next?
Yeah,
That's
next
it.
slide.
So the end goal of the students, of course, is the adaptation of the system, the use of the solutions they have co-created with the community. Here you see a community garden experiment, drinking water that has been filtered with the students, design filters, and a woman cooking with the charcoal made from the animal waste by the student design kiln. Next slide. Prototyping is really key, and that's what School of Industrial Design really puts a lot of emphasis on. The first prototype is done by the students in Canada using manufacturing process, materials, production process that they learned in their immersive visit that utilizes the resources of the community. So it's very same materials, etc. Here we see multiple iterations of innovative beehive that a student built and tested in Canada after his field trip. And next slide. Of course, community process. So the second stage of prototype process is conducted in the community. Often models, samples, simple drawings, and videos are given to the community showing the production process. For the community will adapt and modify the design, and they may see that there's differences, etc. Next slide. And this is the final community prototype. This is what they produce. It's often not the process of building, it is the actions that support the design. Here we see women making, we got our slides mixed up, but you can see that here the students, this is prototypes that were made by the community. They are being tested at this time. And of course, there's adaptation of the design to allow it to be manufactured within the community. Next one.
Okay, so to finish up, so there are literally dozens of projects like we've just seen. So in the past couple of years, we've started working in northern communities. And one of our projects was a mural, which you see here, which was painted by local high school students in the village of Mayo in the Yukon. And so we're just going to play 1 minute of an APTN news piece that APTN did on it. So hopefully the audio works. It's on the next slide.
I'll just stop sharing for a second and then enable audio, Troy. So if you just bear with me a moment. There we go, that should work.
Don't be fooled. This eye-catching mural on the back of the local grocery store in Mayo isn't graffiti. These are actually spray-painted self-portraits created by high schoolers at J.B. Clark School. This is 9th grader Connor Bernhardt's portrait. He says he had fun spending a week working on the project along with his peers.
We did a lot of hard work to get it completed, and let's say it went pretty well.
This mural here? Yeah, I painted the second one.
Irene Melanson says the project brought a touch of color to Mayo.
It makes the community more colorful and not just like plain buildings.
The portraits are part of an initiative to encourage students' mental wellness outside of a clinical setting. It was sparked by grad students at Carleton University, which has a memorandum of understanding with Notchonayakton First Nation in Mayo to collaborate on Indigenous-led projects. Cheyenne Gordon spray-painted this self-portrait. She says working outside the classroom helped relieve stress.
Art, for some reason, seems to calm me after something may have happened or an argument.
Because COVID prevented the grad students
Okay,
from
we can
delivering
stop
the project.
Since we're running out of time here. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so COVID presented some particular problems this past year because field trips were out. but students learn to interact and function in geographically distributed teams, virtual teams. So here you see one of our students on the screen conducting a session of a health and wellness program in Masset in British Columbia. Next slide. Next slide. There. Okay, so of course, none of this is possible without students in the course that we're teaching who are committed and engaged. It's hard, often frustrating work for everyone involved, including the instructors.
Yep.
Keeping student motivation is not always an easy
She can go
task.
in whenever she's ready.
So here you see students engaging in some hard work, tree planting and reforestation of a former plantation next to a village. But if you can put all of these moving parts together, you can get an experience that's rewarding for all of the parties involved. You were good on the last slide because we're done.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you so much. We're just gonna go straight through to the next presentation. We just want to make sure timing wise that we have time for all the presentations. So our next presenter is Carla Ayukawa, who is also from the School of Industrial Design, and she'll be presenting on community engagement with the Canadian Council of the Blind.
Hi, it's Carla. Yeah, that was a really, really interesting project. Mine is a little bit different, but I'll just, it's more about my own experiences with working with the vision impaired community and part of my research project. And I'll also be integrating audio in description, and so for the visual components of my slides. So this slide identifies the groups who contributed to my research. They include Ingenium, Canada's Museum of Science and Innovation, the Canadian Council of the Blind, the READY training program, and the School of Industrial Design. All right, next slide. My research explored accessible museum exhibition design to improve the accessibility of museums for visitors with vision loss. And so the photo on the right is of a museum display that could be considered to be a good example or an example of an exhibit that is not accessible to visitors with vision loss. All right, next slide, please. So I'm going to begin with just some background about my research to give it some context. So the background image on this slide shows museum objects housed in sealed showcase. And this image really reflects a common occurrence that leads to the problem where people with vision loss are underserved in their access to museums. And what do we mean by access? Access not only just includes access to the content, it also includes access to independent and impromptu visits to the museum, the cat, and content that it really considers other senses just beyond vision in the exhibition narrative and the interpretation of these objects. Okay, so the next slide, please. So here I want to say barriers to access can be for visitors with vision loss include like sensory, experiential, and social barriers. And these barriers could be attributed to research and exhibition practices that actually privilege vision. So as a result of those practices, there's a bias towards ocular-centric knowledge, which then contributes to ocular-centric narratives, which then create barriers for people with vision loss. Okay, so next slide. Excuse me. I think we're ahead by one slide. Thanks. So as a result, so my research studied how we might improve access through the exploration of inclusive narratives. And for this, I really needed the collaboration of the vision with the vision loss community. In particular, I needed to know how to engage with participants with distinct sensory abilities who can interpret objects, material culture, really from a non-visual perspective. So in other words, The participants would use their, distinct sensory abilities and kind of life experiences as a result of their vision loss to share their non-ocular centric interpretations and perspectives about this object that traditionally hadn't perhaps been interpreted with an ocular centric narrative. All right, the next slide. Okay, so the study methodology includes participants who are paired in focus groups and who examine the objects while audio and video recorded them. And from those recordings, I conducted a thematic analysis techniques to draw like multiple and diverse kind of narratives from their interpretations and perspectives about the object. So the two objects chosen, and hopefully you can see it in this slide, were the Juicy Salif, which is a lemon juicer, and the Contempra telephone. And the Juicy Salif is shown on the top photo, and it's displayed at, as it was displayed at the Vitra Design Museum. It's that shiny silver object with the three legs that's just to the right, to the left of that red clock. And the object narrative for the Juicy Salif is commonly expressed as it being an object whose popularity was a result of the rise of visual culture in the early 1990s. So very, very kind of a visual narrative. And then the other photo of the Contempra telephone, which is that bottom photo. And this photo shows how it was displayed at the Design Exchange Museum. And here it is that ivory colored object at the top left, which is like displayed on an ivory colored table. And this, the narrative that's usually associated with this object positions it as an example of Canadian post-war design. So again, another very visual or based narrative. Okay, my next slide, please. So in my research, my supervisors and I approached the Canadian Council of the Blind for assistance. And the Canadian Council of the Blind is a national nonprofit organization with members who are blind, deafblind, or living with vision loss. And so their bilingual logo is just shown on the right. And I've displayed their web address here if anyone wants more information about them. So on my next slide. So how did the Canadian Council of the Blind assist me? Well, I consulted with the CCB in the research planning process that included getting their assistance with the written materials, the development of the research kit, pilot testing, and the recruitment of participants. And so as a sighted person, they were able to contribute to things that I just really hadn't thought of, or things that I just didn't have access to. For instance, the CCB's assistance, it was really critical for my participant recruitment because the inclusion criteria required to have participants who have congenital or early onset blindness. And this actual criteria fits, I think it was like less than 3 in 10,000 Canadians have these that particular qualities. But with their assistance, the participant recruitment took me less than 3 weeks, which was much faster than I could have done without their network. Next slide. Okay, so as I said, the CCB helped me work out how to conduct and record the object research sessions. So originally, the strategy in my research plan included in-person focus group sessions in a location, a physical location that could have the audio and video recording equipment in place. So this would allow me to control the recording and make sure that the camera and the audio could capture everything that was happening in these sessions. But of course, the sessions could not be conducted in person, which led to some challenging challenges in the recording and in just the logistics of it all. But with the consultation with the CCB, I was advised, well, at first I was like, well, we'll just get someone to help the people as they were being recorded. But the CCB says, no, that is not appropriate for me to actually design these sessions that require the assistance of a sighted person with the participant. The CCB also advised me how we can conduct those interviews and the recordings. And quite simply, in the end, we use Zoom, the Zoom application, and the participants' own cameras on their laptops or on their iPhones. And I'm showing here the image on the right, just shows how the participant was using his laptop camera to show me how he dials a rotary telephone. I just want to just note here that he's not actually wearing these blue nitrile gloves when he does this. Yeah, the nitrile gloves are those kind of gloves that you wear as a curator to act as a barrier between the human skin and the artifact. So just want to make a note of that. And on the next slide, please. So this slide shows the research kit. And I'll talk about how the CCB assisted me in its design. Yeah, so because of the pandemic, the research kit was designed to be sent via a commercial courier, and the participant would be able to independently have access to this kit. And the CCB identified to me that it was really important to label the content so that, for instance, the nitrile gloves could be distinguished from the other protective padding that was used in the packaging. And it was really important to make it obvious of how the boxes were to be opened. So these are good examples of something me as a sighted person didn't really think about. The photos, shown on the photos on the right, they show the research kit. They also show the envelopes and the boxes containing the objects and how they were all labeled with Braille. And the photo on the top right is of the Braille labeling device that produces these special adhesive embossed labels, much like a Dymo label maker. And that was actually lent to me by the CCB. And one thing though, the participants, when they received this kit by the courier, they were actually very surprised and really appreciated of the labeling, and which kind of made the research experience much more enjoyable for them. So that was really important to me. The next slide, please. Okay, so now I'll talk about the challenges and the benefits of the remote research with the blind community. As mentioned earlier, the percentage of people who could meet the inclusion criteria was something like 0.03% of the Canadians. And because of this, it would have been really difficult to recruit participants locally. So with the remote research, however, recruitment wasn't just limited to Ottawa or Toronto. We could go wider, and there were actually no transportation costs, which was very helpful for me. Yeah, so my participants were located across Canada, and I was actually able to match participants in the focus groups based on their personal traits. So for example, shown on the photo on the bottom right, these participants were really compatible in their personal experiences and perspectives, which probably contributed to them being more open and subsequently sharing some very insightful data. And this pairing might not have been possible in in-person sessions. So another challenge in the remote research included the contact-free courier delivery. And one solution was to add Braille on the outside of the courier packages so that they would know if there was a box that was left outside the door, what it was. In some cases, people, well, anyway. Yeah, so we needed to put Braille on the outside of these packages and really precise instructions to couriers to where to leave those packages so that my participants could actually find them on the front porch. And the next slide, please. If there's time, I'm not too sure if there's time. I'd just like to talk about how their participation really contributed to the results or the findings of my research, which emerged from the thematic analysis. So the findings about the juicy salif included inclusive narratives that, or even perhaps new narratives that could be used in material culture studies and museology. One of the narratives, which is represented in that photo just second to the left, is about the juicy salif projecting a Victorian era aesthetic. And this is something new that probably would not have come out just from a visual examination of the object. So the participants really focused on the object's tactile qualities to come up with this kind of new narrative about this object. Another narrative just represented in the photos here talks, the one with the juicy salif on the table, talks about how the participants were really conscious of the object's spatial presence in terms of its negative space and its positive space and where it fits in a person's environment. And lastly, the photo of the lemon juicer, just kind of shaped as that kind of chicken, speaks about how the lemon juicer can be interpreted as a tool whose function just is mainly to a reflection of a person's identity. All right. And then on the next slide, if there's time, is the inclusive narratives that emerge from the contemporary telephone. So just as a reminder, it's usually interpreted in a visual culture about its contribution to Canadian design. But with the participants, what emerged was they had different narratives that included about hacking, phone phreaking, as they called it. And even what came out of it was actually like an exhibit module about muscle memory, shown in that photo on the far right of how they actually use telephones and how they remember where the numbers are on the keypad. But with all of this, I just want my final lasting, like my final word about this is, I don't think that I would have been able to have had this opportunity if with the CCB, if this Carleton didn't already have more or less an established relationship with this community. And because of that, it just really made my research a lot easier to do. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carla. And I know there's so much to say about these things, and there's such interesting projects that it's really hard to be able to figure out how to do it within, I think, what feels like a really short time. And I feel like I could have listened to both of those presentations forever. But we will stop here and we'll take a 5-minute break. And then we'll pick up with the next presentation. So we just want to make sure that folks have a chance to grab coffee, water, quick bio break. So we'll see you back on here at 10:22. Great, so I just want to check to make sure that our presenters are here. So I think our next presenters are from the READ Initiative. And so Dean Mellway, Boris Vukovic, Cathy Malcolm-Edwards, and Julie Caldwell. And are you here and ready to get started?
I think we are.
Awesome. So over to you.
Oh, thank you, Sama. And just to say, Sama, speaking of community engagement and community members, it's been a pleasure knowing you for so many years. Just want to say I missed your face, and I've been privileged to be the member of the same community that you've been a part of for I've known you for many years now.
Yeah.
So we are coming to you. We're coming to you from READ. READ stands for Research Education, Accessibility and Design. We will tell you a bit more of the story of READ. My role was supposed to be primarily to introduce 3 community engagement superstars, Dean Mellway, Accessibility Advisor with READ and Carleton, Cathy Malcolm Edwards, the lead of the Coordinated Accessibility Strategy and a valuable READ team member, and Julie Caldwell, Assistant Director at READ and the Corporate Secretary for the Canadian Accessibility Network. So they are the people who can really speak to community engagements. Unfortunately, Cathy couldn't join us. Why? Because she's actually helping out with the event. When she had the choice between helping out with the community engagement launch and taking a spotlight, of course, Cathy would choose to help out. So I will try my best to fill in those shoes. So community engagement has always been central to READ right from the start, when Larry McCloskey from PMC and Dean Mellway conceptualized READ back in 2012. And to tell you more about that, I'll pass it over to Dean Mellway.
Thank you, Boris.
Next slide, please.
So, hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Community engagement is really what READ was developed and is all about. And the folks that sort of got it started are in the picture on this slide with Roy Haynes and Karen March and Larry and myself and our patron David Onley. Interestingly enough, it was October 27th, 2011, exactly 10 years ago, that we launched READ and had our first public event. We didn't become formally recognized until August of the following year, but that first event was a community-based event. We invited members of the accessibility community in the Ottawa region to join us and learn about what was going on at Carleton. And we had so many things happening. We did research on research and found over 50 research projects actively engaged, involving every faculty. And we also had so much work done by PMC and Larry and his team over the years that it was clear that Carleton was already in a leadership position for accessibility, but it really didn't have a sort of focal group that could help push that forward. All of the counselors at PMC had large caseloads and they weren't able to do as much as they wanted to do. And so we envisioned READ, which would allow, as research, education, accessibility, and design, would allow us to not just let accessibility happen at Carleton, but to push for it, to really work toward it. And interestingly enough, that first meeting on the 27th of October in 2011 led to a strong relationship with a couple of community groups. One in particular, CanUgan, came forward to us and said, well, we're working in Uganda. We're working on products that are locally made, and how can you help us? And so we quickly connected them with the School of Industrial Design, and over the course of several years, many projects came out of that. Many students went to Uganda and participated in developing new products. And it was really one of the focal opportunities for us to show community engagement in action. We weren't limited to that, and really there was two worlds, and the other speakers will talk about the two different worlds that we were set up and trying to have an impact on. And one was the Carleton community itself, and the other was the greater community involved in accessibility. And so the two speakers that will come after me will and I guess Boris is now going to be Cathy in the second one, and speak to the whole idea of what we're doing internally at Carleton. So many projects that I could talk about. I wanted to highlight a couple. The CanUgan is one. With the help of the whole university, once we established READ, Larry and I pushed hard for Carleton to host an international conference. And in 2014, we hosted the International Conference on Accessibility, the Accessibility Summit. And it brought together some of the leaders and movers and shakers from around the world in the accessibility space. And so we really felt that Carleton could play a big role. And our goal has always been to make sure that we support everyone at Carleton that wants to have a hand in making the world more accessible. And so with that, I will turn it over to Boris again, so he can talk about the first initiative that is leading us forward, and that's the Carleton Accessibility Strategy.
Okay, next slide, please. So this gets us into the theme, which is the realities of working in complex community engagement initiatives. We are going to highlight two. One is internal, and that is the Coordinated Accessibility Strategy, and the other is external, the Canadian Accessibility Network. As I mentioned, Cathy is our lead. She's busy facilitating the other breakout room. So let me give it a try. And of course, I'm not going to do it justice. So apologies for that. Cathy does a much better job with this. So the realities of developing the Coordinated Accessibility Strategy. Well, let's start with the fact that Carleton has embraced accessibility as one of its strategic goals in the Strategic Integrated Plan. So directly from the SIP came this push to create the Coordinated Accessibility Strategy for Carleton. So that is one reality, as in the university really needs to embrace an initiative to help move it forward within the community. But that's not, as we know, that's not it. Directives don't engage communities. So we really needed to do a good job listening to our community on the topic of accessibility, because the coordinating strategy was not just about celebrating Carleton's leadership in accessibility. As Dean has mentioned, we had a really strong history, but it was also about identifying gaps. The strategy went through a multi-phase consultation beginning 2018. Originally, we actually had to extend the timeline for the listening phase. So that's another reality of engaging the community, giving enough time for all the stakeholders to contribute their voices. We collected feedback in many different formats. We ended up with about 100 pages of word-to-word feedback from the members of the community. And this truly covered the Carleton community, obviously students and staff and faculty, but also academic administrative units, labor unions, student government. We have listened to all the stakeholders throughout the community, and we have continued this listening process. It is continuously open to the community to tell us about accessibility at Carleton as we move into the next stage, which is the implementation of the Coordinated Accessibility Strategy. We have very specific objectives and recommendations that we are now working on, and as I mentioned, that Cathy is leading. So those are some of the realities of developing such a sweeping and comprehensive strategy focused on accessibility internally. And now to highlight one external initiative, I'll pass it over to Julie Caldwell, the Corporate Secretary for the Canadian Accessibility Network.
Thanks, Boris. And so to build on what Dean and Boris have shared, READ really does focus its energy around the community and engaging and hearing from stakeholders and contributors to the work that we do. And so in December 2019, we formally launched what is called the Canadian Accessibility Network. And I'm just realizing, next slide, please. That process didn't just happen on one day. It took several months of engaging and discussing. But on December 19th, what we did was we brought together a number of people. I think there were 140 plus individuals who gathered to just really explore, if we build this Canadian Accessibility Network, what does it look like and how are we going to share and what are the priorities? And so you see these three words: connect, engage, and act. And so those are sort of the premise of what we do. From a connecting perspective, this network involves individuals and organizations from both public and private sectors, not-for-profit, community service providers, advocates, and allies from across Canada. At the moment, we're engaging with over 85 individual, either what we call CAN collaborator organizations, those organizations who have said, we're ready and moving forward on the accessibility front, or we know we need to, and so what's next in that conversation, really striving to advance accessibility across Canada from the East Coast to the West Coast. And of course, with that comes the challenges of time zones. It comes also very important, and in our strategy is making sure that we're representative geographically of the provinces across Canada, so the voices in each region are heard and represented. We're looking for EDI and, of course, lived experience. And then we act on what we hear from this pan-Canadian audience as priorities or issues or challenges and opportunities that come up. And so collectively, we make those decisions around what do we see as important. There are sort of 5 fundamental areas that we focus on: community engagement, education and training, policy, employment, and research, design, and innovation. And something new that we're introducing this fall, and actually just later tonight, we have a meeting of this pan-Canadian group of organizations, will be something called a Can Connect Forum, where we see and we heard from our network that they wanted this opportunity to connect and learn and engage. And so we'll be showcasing best practices, unique research, collaborative opportunities across each of those organizations across Canada. And another new initiative that will be shared later tonight is around professional development in the network. I've never worked with an organization that has a more dedicated, committed group who are willing to, or who are dedicated to taking action and moving forward. And within that group, there are a number of exceptional experts and subject matter experts in different areas who will be providing training to build knowledge and capacity within the network, but even more importantly, to the greater public across Canada and even internationally through our great World Wide Web and virtual environments. So in a nutshell, the work of the Canadian Accessibility Network and the READ initiative, truly integrated and community-based, and we couldn't move forward without community informing what we do.
That is all from us. Thank you for listening, and we will pass it over to the next group.
Awesome, thanks so much. And our final presenter for today is Jennifer Gilbert from the Center for Initiatives in Education, talking about stories and strategies from 25 years of community engagement.
Thank you so much, Sama, and thanks everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. So I'm so thrilled to be part of this this event today, and I'm really happy to share some of the ways that the center has been involved with community engagement over the years. Next slide, please. So we've been around for a while, and I prepared for this in a short time frame. So what I did was interview 4 of my colleagues about their experiences with community engagement. And in particular, I asked about teaching moments, times that they had learned something important, definitions of success, excuse me, and engagement strategies. Next slide. And I'm going to, with great difficulty, I winnowed it down to sharing only one quotation from each interview in the interest of time. So I'm going to share some slides that encapsulate one compelling quote from each interview to illustrate different aspects of community engagement. And I'm going to provide a bit of context as you get a chance to read the quote and think about it. And I'm going to ask you to just note for yourself at that point in the presentation, your own reactions or your own reflections to the issues that are raised, because I know that everyone here has experience of their own with their own work in communities. And at the end, I've left a little bit of time in my presentation to build some knowledge together before the 10 minutes is up. Next slide. So first of all, some background. Next, yes. So the Center for Initiatives in Education offers accessibility and learning support to individuals from non-traditional educational backgrounds, particularly those who experience barriers entering into university for reasons of GPA, learning needs, and former educational experiences. Next. And so some of the past programs that we have run and initiated at the center are the Carleton Nunavut BA project, Women's and Men's Bridging programs, Indigenous High School Mentorship Program, Peer Assisted Study Sessions. And the programs that we currently have going on are the Enriched Support Program and the Lifelong Learning Program. And we also have the Indigenous Enriched Support Program, but that is actually transferring to the Center for Indigenous Initiatives. So this year we're in the midst of transferring that. And we have an emerging initiative of refugee and immigrant outreach that is very, very new at this point, and I'll mention that later on. So we continue to work closely with community organizations such as Discovery University, Harvest House, Uville Center, Nunavut, Sivaniksivut, Pathways to Education, and many others. Next slide. So to start off with, I'm going to talk about the bridging programs. These are programs that were started out as non-credit university courses that were available. It was started out as a women's bridging program, and the subject matter came from women's studies in particular, and it was modeled on a similar program at York University. And then in time, we found that there was demand for this from men who had experienced significant barriers as well. And we expanded in time to women only, men only, and just sort of general bridging courses. It started out as non-credit and went on to become a credit program before getting absorbed into the Enriched Support Program. Next slide. So this quotation comes from Rachel Thibodeau, who was one of the people that was involved with coordinating bridging. Petra Watzlawick-Lee was absolutely instrumental in getting it started and coordinating it as well. I interviewed Rachel, and with the bridging program, we really wanted to target those students who, or those potential students who had literally never imagined that they could access university because of their life circumstances. And we worked with a number of different organizations in that process. But when I was interviewing Rachel, one of the things that she shared with me was this quote: "The people you are really targeting might be the least likely to pick up a pamphlet at the library or respond to a poster that crosses their path. They may not have the mental space." So what Rachel was talking about there was that when she first started with the community engagement to encourage people to come and take courses with the bridging program, she took the approach of just putting the information out there, thinking, hey, this is a great program, people are going to want to try this. But she quickly found that there was much more involved, and that it's not enough to simply share information. You need to build relationships. And so another thing that she shared with me, and actually she refers to Patricia in this quote, and Patricia's here today in this group listening right now. She said, some things you just have to keep learning again and again. Patricia taught me this when working on Nunavut projects. You really have to build relationships within marginalized communities. They don't trust the institutional face. And the closer and more long-standing the relationships are, the more fruitful they become. And there's not always a direct link. Do a presentation and get 5 participants. You have to invest time and resources into building relationships, and you may never find out how many participants you end up getting through those connections. So there was a real emphasis on building relationships, and also the challenge of reaching out to understaffed and under-resourced community agencies that were serving some of the people that we were trying to attract to our bridging programs. And she said, building relationships with the staff can be hard to do. They were swamped in ways I couldn't even conceive of. There may be 10, 50, or 100 people also trying to get on their radar. And meanwhile, all they're supposed to be doing is front-facing work with clients. So I will move on to talking about the next program now. But just a reminder, if you have any reaction of your own or any reflection that comes up for you in response to those thoughts from Rachel, please make a note of it. So next I'll talk about the Indigenous high school mentors. Next slide. And you can see this wonderful picture of and it features my friend Patricia, who started this program. Next slide. So again, there was a big emphasis on relationship building. And so I selected this quote to share with you. Staff would sometimes think the mentors were being duped by students who wanted to relationship build rather than work. Mentors would share that they needed the time to form the necessary bonds that would encourage participation. Now, the context for this quote is that the Indigenous high school mentors were university students who were working within local high schools with Indigenous students. And they would attend classes or attend study session periods. And their role was supposed to be to look out for, people who needed help with schoolwork and maybe provide a little bit of on-the-spot help. But and one of the key stakeholders, of course, would be like the teaching staff and the school staff. So sometimes there was this little conflict between what the teacher or what the teaching staff thought should be happening versus what they thought was happening. So they would see mentors and the students sitting together and talking, but not necessarily working on math or working on whatever it was the students had come to the room to work on. And so just to provide a little bit more about what Patricia shared when it came to this quote, she said that the mentors shared with her that when students were experiencing tremendous social difficulties, at times they were just incapable of focusing on schoolwork and they needed that near peer relationship at that particular time. So troubleshooting was a big part of the role, and that involved talking with all of the people involved, mentors, teaching staff, and mediating some of those perceptions about what was going on and the setting priorities, as well as giving some really good training and support to mentors, because the students were dealing with all kinds of very hard-hitting issues that were affecting their schooling. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on, next slide. I'm going to briefly talk about the Enriched Support Program. This picture is a group of peer mentors who, this is not the same mentoring program I just mentioned, but it's a mentoring program within Enriched Support Program. And all of the students in this picture had come through the Enriched Support Program themselves and then came back and were working with the current cohort. Next slide. So in the Enriched Support Program, it is a 4-credit program for students who, thank you, who are trying to get into a program at Carleton. And over time, as our program coordinator, Susan, shared, she says, I have tried to do more of putting ambassadors out there, in part because representation is so important and students need to see themselves reflected in the people who are telling them about this program. Get students to be the face of the program. Next slide. Okay, and then I'll finally mention a new initiative that is emerging at the moment at the center. Next slide. This is very new. One of our instructors came back from a sabbatical having done some work in collaboration with an Anglican group here in Ottawa that was involved with sponsoring refugees and trying to increase resources and knowledge and awareness to support refugees. Next slide. So when I spoke with Beth Hughes, the instructor who is engaging in this, I asked about her motivation for getting started, and this is what she said. I had a student in my class who was inappropriate for our program, but he had no other access to university. He was a refugee with mental health issues, and he eventually left our program. The services at the university didn't meet his needs. There was not enough knowledge within our department about how to serve refugees. And just to share a little bit more about what Beth said, she talked about putting yourself in the shoes of someone who's not familiar with the system. And she also said that she has had a growing desire to actively participate in the wider Ottawa community, which I think a lot of us can relate to. Next slide. So next slide, thanks. These are some of the themes that I started pulling out of these interviews, and I'd like to pause and just ask people to put in the chat, what are some of the themes that resonated with you as you were listening to some of those quotations? And you could just put one word if you wish, and I believe we have about 1 more minute, so we'll just do it through the chat instead of talking. Yes, absolutely. Definitely relationship building, that was huge, came through with everything. Yeah, and I bet you have some great stories as well about that. Is there anything else that jumped out at anyone? Yes. Yeah, empathy, we don't know what we don't know. Challenges for sure, learning from stakeholders, yes. Yeah, empathy and compassion for sure. Yeah. Yeah. One final invitation if you want to throw anything else in there that you feel should be out. It's a little bit of a truncated way of having a discussion, but it works. Next slide. So this is where I just invited you to share. Next slide. So I just wanted to yeah, it has to be absolutely a long-term, and you don't know, there's no, yeah, it's hard to measure outcomes because it's not always very direct. When you're building relationships in itself is a maverick kind of a move, right? But it's necessary. So a concluding thought from my colleague Beth. Through these experiences, I realized how inaccessible the university can seem to people. Names on a website are not enough. There is so much expertise and knowledge at both ends. It would be great to bring that together. When I heard about Community Engagement Center, I thought there are possibilities here. So just wanted to end on that note. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you so much. And I think this is a good time to stop for a few questions, comments, things that folks might say. I don't know that we'll have time for a lot of discussion, but I would invite any comments or questions about any of the presentations you've heard so far before we move into the strategic planning part of the conversation. I see something in the chat from Bessa Whitmore, who says one of the challenges is the semester system and the fact that student involvement is systematically usually short term, but is the faculty member, sorry, I have no idea what is happening with the chat. I'm going to try to pop it out and see if I can see it better. It's the faculty member who has the possibility of forming longer term relationships. To what extent can the university system be changed in this regard? And so I would invite any of the presenters so far to, if you have some thoughts around involving students and thinking about whether and how we might be able to change the university system to allow some longer term engagement.
We've run into this with our project between Troy and myself, that the students actually graduate. It's their fourth year's capstone project for the ID. And what has happened is that we know when you're doing product development and product design, often what is needed is more analysis, et cetera, on potential manufacturing processes, marketing, user testing, evaluations. So actually the Sprott School of Business then has now had another course that Troy is doing, where these graduate students are actually from School of Industrial Design are interacting with fourth year students to bring these projects forward. And so they're actually volunteering their time and putting effort into doing this from the ID side of it, but really working with the business students to see how they could actually get this product or system or service to the users. And it's so it was really the faculty of Sprott initiating this.
Yeah, and this was actually an unintended positive consequence of COVID, because what happened was the capstone project for industrial design wasn't able to participate last year. So we had, what are we going to do with our business students? And so we had to think really long and hard about how we were going to do it. And what this did is it provided a way for us to maintain some continuity in the projects. One of the problems is, it almost feels like an in and out kind of thing where the students come in, they present sort of a not half-baked, but a project that isn't ready for prime time, and then they're gone. They get their jobs, they're super motivated and enthusiastic during their project, and they say, oh, we want to keep going, but then they get a job and they can't do it. And so this has been a way to actually help make the impact happen by bringing the projects to actual implementation.
It also means that the professors of those students, like myself or like Troy, have had to actually stay in contact with graduate students, which is actually an asset too, because you can bring them in and get them to discuss things. But you need, as the instructor, to put that time into working with those students and discussing the things, because you're involved. You're just basically part of the process.
Thanks so much. And so I'm hearing in both of your responses that again, this kind of reference to relationship building and thinking about how certain relationships might help to kind of overcome some of the. Julie, I think you unmuted yourself, and I don't know if it's because you wanted to jump in. And so we'll go to you.
Sure, thank you. And just super quick, I was simply going to say, I know in my former hat when I worked at the Sprott School of Business, Sprott has been very intentional about the engagement of students from the moment they accept their offers and through their journey from first year to fourth year. We have a student success officer there. And so part of the purpose of that role and the support is to establish these relationships, and we invite them into, I say we as if I'm still there, but I feel like I'm still there sometimes, we invite them, yeah, conversations about almost everything that happens at the school so that they're informing and contributing. Because when I used to work with my hat directly with students, we assumed that they were themselves connected with themselves, and they weren't always. And so bringing them together and having them inform the conversations and bring their unique ideas and perspectives really helps build those relationships, solidify foundations, and gets them more engaged, not just in the school and in their academics, but in other extracurricular activities across campus.
Thanks, Julie. Bjarki.
Yeah, hi. First, I just want to apologize because I have an 11 o'clock, so I'll just sneak in a couple of comments. On a different note, I think one of the challenges in the university environment is funding. Troy has alluded to how he has managed to do this work, but at great work to himself and students to run some fundraising, and it's been well done. But in terms of research funding, I see some challenges with, and this perhaps personal, but I've run into several situations where I have had funding that's non-renewable, either because it came from foundations or IDRC particularly, which doesn't follow up funding. So that makes it kind of challenging too. Also, I think bridging the gap, one suggestion I have is bridging the gap between graduate students and undergraduate students to help the longevity. But I think sustainability is one of the main challenges, in fact, of community engagement, and perhaps the most important in terms of making real impact, because it does take time, and it is about relationship, and it is about maintaining those relationships, those trusts, and that involvement. So that's all I wanted to say on that research front.
Thanks so much, Bjarki. We'll hear next from Boris and Dean, and I think this is really setting us up nicely to move into some of the strategic planning and thinking already about what are some of the things that are made possible, what are some of the kinds of challenges we might want to be thinking about how to address. So thank you all so much for everything you've shared so far. Boris?
And thanks, Bessa. So this is about the students. I'll focus on funding, money. It makes a difference. Many students have to work to make it through post-secondary education, and they will take any kind of job out there. So us being able to offer work within our units, our projects, yes, we can absolutely overcome the semester type of constraints, and we can have students for the duration of their studies, but sometimes after they graduate as well. We can provide part-time work, if not full-time work. And since we stole Julie from Sprott, she's been great at doing just that with our students. And Julie can reflect on CAN and student engagement, but I think Dean also has a few thoughts on that.
Yes, thanks, Boris. I just wanted to comment that in all of the exciting, wonderful projects we've been able to be involved in over our 10 years as READ, there's been a lot of the main participants from a student perspective have been final year students or graduate students. And it occurs to me that the earlier we can engage students in their program with things related to community, the better. Maybe a little more emphasis on the co-curricular record and getting students to build sort of participation in community right from the beginning, and that way it allows time for that long-term relationship. And also the jobs thing that Boris was talking about, when students can get work related to their field instead of just working at McDonald's, it's so much better for them in the long term and so much better for the student in developing relationship.
Thanks so much, Dean. So before we move into the strategic planning, I just wanted to also invite Carla, if you have any thoughts around how to maintain and to build sustainable relationships in the kind of work that you've been doing, because you know, I hear that a lot went into building those relationships. What are some lessons around how to sustain them that you might be able to offer?
Oh, how to sustain them. Well, I think I was in a fortunate position because I came into my graduate studies after being working in the industry for a long time. And so I had that already established. But what was really great, what was really, really helpful was the fact that when I needed to answer the question about, okay, who can I ask to help me with this? It was that, like, it was obvious. And for my supervisors to make up one phone call, that they were like, the organization was on board from the beginning to establish relationships that had happened earlier. Also, one of my participants, actually I went to university with, you know, 1,000 years ago. So there was trust. And I think it really is about the trust. And because if there is, like, they're going into it knowing, okay, this is just a project, something could come out of it, something maybe not, but this organization was also looking at the long-term relationship. And I think that was, yeah, that was quite, it was very well established to begin with. And I really was able to kind of take advantage of what Carlton has already created. So from a student point of view, I think, yeah, there are kind of small bits, but from like a bigger ideas that, yeah, maybe a project couldn't go to completion, like with what Stephen Field said, like it really is a longer thing, but for some places they understand that it's like a 20-year or 50-year commitment that they're making with Carlton. I don't know if that helps.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think that this I think it's really helpful to have heard from all of you on this. And I know, Jennifer, you were adding some comments in the chat as well. And I think that, again, like this really sets us up very nicely for moving into the next part of what we're doing together today, which is really thinking about how do we strategize as an organization around community engagement.